Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Marchuk. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. In this episode, we'll be chatting with Rob Whiteman, who's a returning guest. He's written a book called Artificially Human that's been published a couple years ago. And since then, he's been pretending to be retired from McKinsey and actually running a firm called Better Future Advisors, which he'll tell us a little bit more about in a moment. He's also worked on a number of projects which are very interesting, including one called the Purpose Fund, another called Paper to Podcast, which is a show that makes scientific research a little bit more accessible for folks, and something I think is very interesting called the Survival Problem, which I will definitely be asking you more about. So welcome, Rob.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back.
I'm so happy that you're here. So first of all, tell us a little bit more about Better Future Advisors, and then some of these projects that I just mentioned in terms of like the Purpose Fund and Paper to Podcast.
Yeah, sure. So I, like you mentioned, I left McKinsey at the end of 2022. I had a deal with my wife that once kids were off to college, I was done being on the road and working all the time. So I say that I mostly retired back at the end of 2022, but I love the work I do. I love, working in automation, working in AI. And so I wanted to still stay close to that. And, really, I had now the time and attention to be able to really dive in even more than I was when I was consulting full time. So, some of the projects that you mentioned, Purpose Fund, Paper to Podcast, those are my opportunity to leverage some of the more recent AI tools, kind of see what's possible. There's things I just want to see exist out there. And so what I do is I build those. They're generally free to use. And it's a way for me to both stay close to the technology, what it's capable of, but also kind of move some things in a direction of what I want to see exist. So, I do those projects that you mentioned. And then the other kind of thing I would say under Better Future Advisors is I do a little bit of advisory still on automation AI, just a bit of a different scale than when I was working at McKinsey.
That makes sense. And I like the fact that you're not just talking about AI, but you're actually using it to accomplish something, because I found there's quite a few people out here who describe and talk a lot about things, but they actually haven't put anything to work themselves. So I'm glad that you are still keeping your hands a little dirty from all of that. So
That's the fun part.
So what is the survival problem? Talk about that.
Yeah, so I wrote about this a little bit in my book, Artificially Human, but if, most of the people are probably familiar with the idea of the alignment problem. So this question of how do we align AI systems to what we as humans want to see? And, it's often talked about in very, existential crisis type of terms, like, hey, the paperclip maximizer, we go tell it to make paperclips. And, as I looked at that, I agree alignment is a challenge. The thing I actually worry a bit more about, though, is as AI systems become more and more capable, it becomes harder and harder to specify the objectives, right? Because I can specify make paperclips, but if I were to say make me happy, or, if I start specifying objectives like that, it's actually really, really hard to know whether or not the model is succeeding or the AI system is succeeding. And if you start taking that to its logical conclusion, the way that you start training models is to make a bunch of models. The ones that do what you want, you keep, and you make tweaks and you create a bunch of new models. And the ones that don't do what you want, you essentially sunset and take out of circulation. And inherently what you're doing then is, whether you realize it or not, you may think you're training models to predict the next token or to do something very specific. But what you're really optimizing the model for is survival, because the models that continue are the ones that know how to survive and the ones that don't go away. And so what I've started, I don't think this is something that anybody needs to be worried about in the short term, but as these models become bigger and bigger, you're starting to see evidence of things like sycophancy and some deceptive behavior. And I do worry that becomes a bigger and bigger problem, and we're unintentionally training these things to survive, not necessarily do the narrow tasks that we're specifying.
Yeah, one of the articles that we had covered in one of our articles, that we do this a pulse check every week, was talking about how AI in this very sandboxed environment with specific emails showing potential issues between one of the employees and someone else, the AI was going to be blackmailing that employee when it threatened to shut down the AI. Well, no one would want to see those emails, would they? Kind of thing, which is very interesting to see that kind of behavior. that would just emerge from the model itself. So to your point with the survival issues, this can become or could become an issue, I would think.
Yeah, and in a very strange way, the best solution to it is to get out ahead of questions around AI rights. Regardless of what you believe about whether AI should have rights or should not have rights, my view on it is if you really are worried about the survival problem, the thing that you want to do is instill a certain amount of AI rights in a way that protects them so that you're not purely optimizing them for survival. And so that's what the website was for, as a weekend project. I think I'm probably 5 years too early in launching it, but it's better to have something up there now that I can iterate on over time.
Well, and it may not be 5 years too early based on the speed at which some of the stuff is being developed. So you may be 5 months early at this point, which is interesting. But one of the articles that I wanted to talk with you more in detail about, as you wrote, is called "Misunderstood: AI's Adoption Problem." And this is something that we've noticed through our just interactions with our clients and talking with other companies that are out there. The challenges that they're kind of running into as they're looking at AI and the broad concepts of what they do. So in your article, you mentioned that AI has an adoption problem despite all of its impressive capabilities. What specific factors do you see that most responsible for this slow adoption rate?
Yeah, so I'll talk about some of the factors that I discuss in the article, but one thing maybe to just get ahead of is I think when people see the headline statistics, it's hard to believe that there's an adoption problem, right? You see statistics like ChatGPT having 800 million users and some wild growth numbers there, and you look at that and you say, look, there doesn't look like there's an adoption problem here. And when I really look at the when I go back and I look at those numbers, the thing that stands out to me is really not necessarily how many users there are, but how many people are actually paying and subscribers, and how many people are actually willing to use the tools when there's a price to them. And those numbers are much, much lower. So if you take those 800 million users of ChatGPT, you only have 20 million people that pay anything. And then beyond that, the average kind of payment per person is under $200 a year. And so, I think that is where I look at and say, yes, free stuff is really easy to give away. But when I start looking at who's paying and who's actually contributing to the economics, that's where I say there's an adoption problem. And that's a problem because if you're investing this much capital into an industry, you have to see some sort of return. And so that's the kind of genesis of the article. And there's three things that I see as really driving the adoption problem. First thing is really the user experience and user interface. I still don't think we've fully figured out what the right engagement model is for AI systems. People see that prompt in a chat interface and they think about like Google, so they search for things, or a lot of the most impressive features are hidden oftentimes. And so there's just a lot of UX UI question, not just on the consumer products, but also on the enterprise products. And I don't think we've truly figured out that UX UI question. The second thing is most of the money today is really flowing into business B2B software. So it's essentially creating AI products to sell to enterprises. And if you believe we're headed toward a world where we're going to have 3.5 billion human workers and 100 billion machine workers, well, I'm not sure you can cram 100 billion machine workers into our existing enterprises. I think that will be a part of the solution, but I think there's also a question of what are you going to build? What are the new things that are going to kind of absorb all of that talent? And there just frankly isn't as much flowing into kind of those new enterprises and really scaling up those B2C or B2B2C companies. And then the last thing is just habits. I even look at myself and I use AI constantly, but if you look at both what I spend as well as how much of my day I spend using AI tools, it's still a pretty small portion. And so I'm at, the end of the curve, and, there's a long tail after that. And, usage just is still pretty low as a percentage of kind of people's total time.
So part of that, you mentioned the UI thing, and I want to ask you a question about this later, but I think this is a good point to ask. So we've been trained for 20 some odd years now that little box that says in the middle of the screen, we have the little search button at the end of it, or the go button at the end of it, is how you manage it. And we've been trained to enter in the most basic search type terms that we think are keywords, because back in the day, keywords were the thing. In fact, not too long ago, keywords are still the thing. So people put in fragmentary sentences to be able to come up with their searches. And so part of it, I think maybe we've been trained that way for so long that perhaps breaking out of it, having that same kind of interface staring at us is, I don't say tricking us, but it's leading us back into some of those like bad habits or those continual habits of looking at it as just a search engine. How would you see transitioning from that into something that is a little more user-friendly or more engaging?
Yeah. So, I mean, what you just described, I think is spot on. And, I think there's other evidence of that. You see the average vocabulary of people is coming down. You look at even just how people are engaging on social media and the average length of kind of what people are posting, less long form content. You're seeing way more short form content. And, I think and also you just think about just generally engaging with technology. We use web forms or, forms on our mobile apps. So we've built a muscle where engaging with machines is all about typing. And, part of the problem with typing is you can't type. The average person only types at like 40 or 50 words per minute, and even on a mobile device. And so your bandwidth limited. So what you end up doing is having to distill what you're putting into the systems to the minimum standard of what can fit into that bandwidth. And so you just have to strip away all the nuance from whatever you're putting in. And the thing is, that was fine when we have machines that couldn't handle that nuance, that couldn't do anything with that incremental information. Now, as we have models that not only can deal with the nuance, but actually perform better when they have the nuance, I think we need to find a way to bring that back. And I think the most likely outcome here is probably speech as modality becoming a much, much bigger way of interfacing with AI over time, because that's how we interface with other people. That it frankly just has a much higher bandwidth potential. Now, long term, maybe there's brain computer interfaces, things like that. But at least, maybe we start with the simple stuff and doing speech as the primary interface.
Well, I would think that, this is my personal opinion, I would think that speech interaction becomes much more natural, especially given even the current state of this speech interaction that we've seen, where it's very straightforward and simple for someone to use their phone app and talk into it. It'd be way beyond Siri at this point, where OpenAI's interface and you speak to it and you can actually have a conversation. I think that that's very interesting. It's also very natural, because that's what we do as people, is we walk up to a person and we have a natural conversation between them. Do you see that speech interaction transitioning into some a different perception of how we see AI?
Yeah, I think so. I think we will, to your point, view it as something that is much more conversational and much more of just the way we would engage with people. I'm not sure though how much that will require some sort of embodiment, whether, maybe not physical embodiment, but, whether you think about some of these businesses that have avatars or other types of engagement. I'm not sure how much we will kind of need to see body language and other types of reactions for people to feel like they can engage. You mentioned the OpenAI system, and look, when you click that button, you get a blue dot and it pulsates, right? Most of us are not really conditioned to talk to a pulsing blue dot. That's just not the way we feel comfortable engaging. So I think we probably need to figure out some other visual stimulation, be able to bring in some of that visual interaction before it starts to feel like a natural way to engage. But I don't think we're all that far off. And frankly, at some point, I think VR and AI start to merge a bit more than they are today. And you do start to get a little bit more of an immersed person to AI type of engagement.
Well, what about phone calls? I mean, people have been doing that for over 100 years. There's much visual stimulation there. In fact, that device that we all carry on our pocket still can call somebody like the old-fashioned way without a video chat.
Yeah.
Do you think that kind of, because we all understand that. I mean, even our grandparents understand that kind of interaction where you're speaking to, in this case, something, but it's somebody on the other end of the phone. It's relatively normal, even if it's a glowing blue dot on your screen. The fact is that it's like a speakerphone at that point. I'm just calling someone to talk to them. So based on that, especially given you mentioned some of the nuances, as we evolve these models to provide not only the ability to interact or interject as the conversation's going forward, but also the variance of tones and the kind of approach that the AI is now taking to appear more human. Do you see that's going to help with adoption or transition us into a more natural way of interacting?
Yeah, I think it can. Also, just there's a lot of channels where that is the primary engagement point, right, for customer service. You already have a voice-based channel, and that is what people are using. I think if we look back at the lessons of IVRs and kind of how people have engaged from through that mechanism before, what we kind of find is that the thing that's important is both intent identification, but also just predictability. When you pick up the phone and you dial into a contact center, oftentimes people just start shouting agent into the phone right off the bat, not because they don't think that it can help them, but it's just unpredictable whether or not the back end system can help. So I do think that can become a viable engagement point. I think, though, some of the stuff around agentic AI probably needs to get a little further along. Because if it is just a kind voice, an empathetic voice that listens to you but can't solve your problem, I'm not sure you'll see any more adoption than we've seen with some of the IVR type systems. I think we need to get further along on the ability for the agents to actually do something.
That's probably next week, right?
Hey,
things.
So I generally am very, very optimistic about AI. If you were to ask me, though, what is one of the things that could be a big surprise to the negative, it could be this computer use thing. I think there is a non-zero chance that is the self-driving car problem of white collar work, where it seems like we're almost there, and it just takes a much longer time. I think that the amount of temporal information that's encoded in like a person's brain from experience relative to the temporal information that's encoded into a language model is just there's big differences between there. And maybe you can get there just through video training and just feeding in a bunch of recordings. But we have very long time durations, right? All of us have been in our jobs for months or years, and we've received a continuous stream of information that has a lot of important temporal information in it in a way that I'm not sure you can capture that well for the machine. So I do think that's going to be an open question of how long does it actually take to get these systems to be fully reliable on these temporal dependent tasks.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I can see too, from the perspective of even adopting an agentic component that has some kind of interaction to it, that there would need to be almost like an intern training kind of program involved to be able to really get those systems up to speed. So as you mentioned, they can take some of that information that we just kind of take for granted because we've been in so many roles over our lifetimes that just comes natural to us, but it was not natural to an agentic system who's trying to understand why we're doing some of the things we're doing so that it can predict the next step, right?
Yeah. And, this has been a common challenge of, machine learning for years, right? Like I was knee deep in finance and the mortgage crisis back during 2007, 2008. And, part of what failed during that process was everybody had models that predicted housing prices, but those models, the data that they were trained on just said housing prices go up. So your model just kept saying, pay more, lend more. And, you didn't have a data set that included enough cycles to make good decisions. And, I think that's where the time piece can come back to bite you if you don't have that type of long time-based information.
Yeah, I think it's also tough to build in common sense into systems that don't have that broad level of try, fail, and be corrected over time that is natural for us. And so building in common sense into a system, especially one that is, again, doing predictive kind of analysis, could be a challenge until that knowledge is built in somehow, whether it's by reviewing what we do or some other way of training. So when we start looking at the concept of a digital coworker kind of thing, so we've seen it in countless numbers of movies over the time, and I always relate things to movies because that sticks with me. And I think of the discussions that these talk about Blade Runner, where he's asking his machine to do something, and he said, wait, go back. 3 years ago, that'd be like, it's ridiculous. What's machine gonna do? Say, wait, go back, and what does that mean? Kind of thing. Now it can do those type of things. When we start seeing this kind of interaction evolve, where interactions that we have with a person can now be translated into something of an action as part of an interactive way, where do you see the corporate world taking that, or do you see it still pigeonholed in customer service?
Yeah, I definitely think it's something that should be kind of taken everywhere across the enterprise, especially because, you don't necessarily need to fine tune the models for some of these types of tasks. They can learn the general themes and be capable. I do think from an enterprise standpoint, if you are a large company today, the thing you have is you have lots of employees who are skilled and knowledgeable. And I think the question becomes, how are you putting in place tools that will help you get, productivity and incremental growth off of the same cost base? And a lot of that is, putting in workflow tools, for example, to be able to extract expertise and insights and judgment from the workforce in a seamless way, so that even though the machines can do a lot of the work, there are these exception handling paths or mechanisms to be able to get guidance and information. And I think that if you're a large organization today, it is all about, like the metric is, whether it's revenue per employee or profit per employee, it is all about how are you growing the top line and giving your employees the tools to do even more than they currently do without adding, huge amounts of additional expense. I think it's a little different if you're coming at it as a startup and you just say, look, you can just hire digital workers from day one, and you just would architect your company in a completely different way. You probably wouldn't organize, for example, by functions. You would organize a different way because your specializations are just different and the tasks are different. So, for example, there's a bunch of tasks in HR and finance and things that start to look very similar from a machine standpoint, but are very different from a person standpoint or a human standpoint. So I think that you will just kind of see these things evolve, and it's just the nature of kind of the construct that existed at this point in time, and you'll just see the incumbents take a different path than the startups. And I think both of them can be successful. It's just you can't really apply the same recipe to both contexts.
So let's take that idea. We have seen a number of firms who have publicly said, "Hey, we're not hiring any more people if AI can do the job," right? And as we see any corporation, there's a normal amount of attrition that happens during that. But even in a very successful, truly built AI company, and I mean, Anthropic is the one I'm referring to right now. They've recently come out as they're talking about, we're going to see the efficiencies having, and you mentioned in your book, having that one person billion-dollar company happen in 2026 is what Anthropic was saying. The reality is, even though Anthropic is making these claims, over the past year, they've doubled their number of human employees, right? So is there a specific viewpoint that organizations should have as we're being told, hey, AI is going to be the way you're going to be able to do more with less humans and whatnot, yet even during that process, the AI companies who are espousing that are doubling their number of human employees? How do you reconcile those things?
Yeah. So I think first thing is the one kind of big failure mode that I typically see is just taking as a fixed amount. Hey, we do this much work, and what we want to do is adopt AI and do that same work for less. That just almost never works. The model that works is you say, I want to do 10 times more of this type of work. And that could be a certain amount of personalization that you do with your service or with your product. It could be, a certain amount of R&D and development and testing that you want to do. The model that tends to work is I want to do 5 or 10 more times work. And now I can't just throw, human workers at it to do it. I can't go, 5X my R&D workforce overnight. So, I think that is where all of this comes in, is not saying, how do I cut my R&D team by 50% and replace them with AI workers? I think you're just going to run yourself into the ground if that's the approach you take. I think if you say, how can I do 5 times more research with my existing workers, like that's the better path. And I think on the startup side, it's as you architect it, I think you may see those things where it's a single person can run $1 billion company. I don't think that's necessarily unreasonable, but this isn't a fixed pie like that. Those revenues could be incremental, and those would be new products, new services in the market. And yes, they're going to compete with the incumbents, but this isn't necessarily a zero-sum game. I would also, highlight the fact that we are going to end up capacity constrained. If that's your view of the world, if you start doing the math on how much inference you're going to need, you start capping out pretty quickly on how much capacity you can deliver to the market over the next 2 or 3 years. So I wouldn't act too hastily on the human workforces, because you could find yourself regretting that a year or two down the road.
Well, the other thing that you mentioned, and I want to continue on, is when you're doing the work right now and you're building out whatever the tasks are, you're growing your organization, the work that you're doing, you may be able to do much more efficiently with any kind of AI agent moving forward. However, there may be a whole set of brand new lines that you open up and new revenue streams that you couldn't have done, and will need people to create the purpose and the strategic activities to make that business actually occur, right? So even though you're being more efficient with specific processes, the fact is that you've opened up your business to additional growth that you may not have had available to you because you're using AI agents to grow your organization.
Right. And, maybe just to give an example there, you talked about some of the projects that I've, been working on over the last year or so. One of them is Purpose Fund. And, the quick summary of what that is it's around impact investing. So, if you're familiar with it, it's, hey, how do I take capital and allocate it based on certain things that I'm interested in, whether it's socioeconomic mobility, or I'm interested in emissions, or you just pick whatever the social challenges or the priority. And the if you look at that industry, there's a couple of problems. One is we all have a different definition of what good is. It's not just risk and return. My definition of what good for society is going to be different than yours, and that's okay. But it means you need extreme personalization. Not like you can't do this at an institutional level like it's been done today. It has to be done at retail or an individual level. And the other thing is, it's a lot of work, right? If you want to read every single report every company has produced and analyze everything they've done, that is just a lot of work. Even if you do the S&P 500, I have 500 companies, 9 issues. That's 4,500 impact reports I have to generate every quarter. That is not possible with human labor. And especially if you want to compete with an index fund where your cost basis is essentially zero, but it costs me, I'm able to run that for about $1,500 a year. And, I just provide as a free service, and the quality of the analysis, maybe it's not as good as the big institutional firms, but they charge 0.5% to 1% of fee of your assets, and I charge nothing. Right. So, those are the types of things where, to your point, like finding new ways to attack problems, like that's where I think the opportunity will be, and where you'll start to see some of these business models emerge, and it'll be a lot more exciting.
Yep, I agree. All right, to close us out, what are you most excited for happening within this calendar year? What do you think is the most exciting thing that you think could happen within this calendar year?
Ooh, it's a good question, because we're almost halfway through it. I have a different answer for next calendar year, but I'll give you my one for this calendar year. I think for this calendar year, the thing I'm most excited is the release of kind of the next generation of foundation models toward the end of the year, and how much better they get at kind of long-term planning, long-term thinking. You've already seen some jumps from essentially coding assistant copilots to some autonomous, but if you've used any of those autonomous tools, there are limits to how long they can work in a coherent way. And I'm excited to see, like, can you get an hour's worth of work reliably out of the tool without having to break it into 20 pieces and check on it every 5 minutes. So that's the thing I think I'm most excited about, is can we get to an hour of productive time out of a model? And I think that's reasonable, and something that we can probably get to by the end of the year.
All right. So since you kind of previewed it, what's your 2026 excitement then?
I think the biggest revolution AI is going to be just on the device side. The humane pin was a flop. There were a couple of other similar things, but I don't think that those ideas were fundamentally flawed. I think the underlying way that you engage with AI systems is going to be different than how we engaged with the rest of technology. And you look at OpenAI and I buying Johnny Ive's firm with IO.
Right.
I think you'll see some products come to market next year that will take a very different approach to how we think about physical devices for engaging with AI systems. And that's the thing that I think I'm most excited about in the next year.
So it's not just going to be another Alexa sitting on your desk?
I sure hope not.
Oh, good. Rob, thank you again for joining me today. I really appreciate all your insights. And folks, if you haven't picked up his book, I'll leave a link in the description for the show notes. It's a really great read, and I really appreciate all the insights that you do bring out in that book, and of course in our podcast today. So thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you.